I am Ellen Miller, the co-founder and executive director of the Sunlight Foundation. Before I begin my remarks, I want to tell you a little bit about the Sunlight Foundation. We were founded in 2006, so we were an 8-year-old NGO to use the power of the internet to catalyze greater government openness and transparency with one single goal, and that is to create a better balance of power through the free flow of information about who is trying to influence our politicians and our government and what they get in return. We do so by demanding open data from government and building tools, easy-to-use tools, to access that data, by advocating for new policies or enforcement of old policies to bring disclosure up to 21st century standards, by undertaking journalism and providing grant opportunities to dramatically expand vital access to government information. Our vision is to use technology to enable real democracy at all levels of government, complete, equitable, and effective democratic participation. Our overarching goal is to achieve changes in the law to require real-time online transparency for all government information, with special access on the money flow to political parties and candidates, and who tries to influence government and how government responds. We believe fundamentally that information is power, and when there is disproportionate access to information, citizens are left in the dark, powerless. We are committed to realigning the balance of power by improving access to government information, by making it available online, redefining public information to mean online information. This is our team in Washington, and we are believers in what one US Supreme Court justice said about 100 years ago: sunlight is the best of disinfectants. It is from that Supreme Court justice that we take our name, the Sunlight Foundation. We approach our work in numerous ways. We work with thousands of software developers, local transparency activists, bloggers, on and offline active citizens, and journalists, involving them in distributed research projects, hackathons, targeted lobbying, knowledge transfer, and training. Sunlight's policy team, which is led by my colleague John Wunderlich, who you will hear from later, pushes for improved transparency policy through CSO efforts like openingparliament.org and through traditional lobbying of government. Our reporters cover influence stories both through reporting and through close collaboration with technical staff, leveraging computer-assisted reporting and data visualization techniques. And in Sunlight Labs, which is led by my colleague Tom Lee, who you will hear from very shortly, our team of technologists and designers create apps and websites to bring information directly to citizens, as well as building APIs that power the applications of others. We do this work because we have a fundamental problem in the United States that threatens our democracy. We allow for the private financing of public elections, fueled by a very tiny elite number of donors. Making matters worse is that public access to information about who those donors are and what they are seeking from government is at best woefully delayed and frequently entirely denied. And the situation in the United States is getting worse. Think about it for a second. An opaque system of private financing of public elections. As one of the US's founding fathers, James Madison, once said, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." His statement would apply to any democracy around the world. In a nutshell, here's how the problem of undisclosed political financing plays out in the United States. Only elite, wealthy interests give most of the money in politics. In the 2012 election, 28% of all disclosed political contributions came from just 31,000 people. In a nation of 314 million, those donors represent the 1% of the 1%, an elite class that increasingly serves as gatekeepers to public office in our country. Let's do a little experiment about what that might look like. But everyone stand up. Just indulge me for a moment. Everyone, please stand up. So, thank you. We have a little stretch here. I'd like the last 2 rows of tables, that's about half of you. You sit down, please. You are not registered to vote. And what I'm going to show you is how many people in our democracy in the US actually count. So we have about half of you sitting down. That's great. Then I want another half of you to sit down, maybe the 4 tables on this side of the room here. Just sit down. Thank you very much. You're registered to vote, but you don't vote. Now, I want everyone, but this gentleman in the white shirt right here in this center table, everyone else, please sit down. This gentleman right here, he represents the 1% of the 1%. So you in the United States determine who runs for office. And you determine pretty much who wins office. You also advise the congressmen and the senators and the president about what kinds of policies you would like. You want reporting, or you want no reporting on extractive industries? You've got it, because you paid for my campaign. You want a housing policy, or a healthcare policy, or a labor policy, or an environmental policy that you think is good for you and your family. You are a very wealthy man. You can have whatever you like. He's one of our state-elected representatives, by the way. Randomly selected. Thank you for being my volunteer. But you do represent the 1% of the 1%. And here's why that scares us. America's biggest campaign contributors have little in common with average Americans. They hail from predominantly large cities like New York or Washington. They work for big corporations like Goldman Sachs and Exxon. 1 in 5 works in the finance, insurance, and real estate industry. 1 in 10 is a lawyer or a lobbyist. They are wealthy, and they do not look like the rest of America. But these are the interests who control American elections. The 1% of the 1% are the political gatekeepers of American politics. They set the boundaries of acceptable political topics and positions. That is, what they care about and what they believe. Sure, we have a system of 1 person, 1 vote. But in reality, the wealthy elect our candidates, make sure they win, and whisper in their ears about what kinds of policies they want. Allow me to diverge for 1 more moment and tell you a story about my eldest daughter, now herself a mother of 3 little ones. Enter Annie. When she was about 4 years old, I took her to the polls one day. I set about to teach her about what a democracy was all about, where everyone has the right to vote, to choose the leaders of our country, and we have a responsibility to do that. No doubt I went on a little too long in my lecture on the way into the polls. So after I cast my ballot with her at my side, I said, now, what do we call our country, the kind of government we have, where everyone has the right to vote, 1 person, 1 vote? And she stammered, clearly trying to find that word democracy again, and she said, it's a disaster. Such wisdom from a young child. She would be most embarrassed to know her 4-year-old picture was here. Not only does big money determine who the candidates will be and what their policies are that they will pursue, since the candidates who raise the most money in the US win 90% of the time, but the elite few pick the winners of the elections before the voters ever have a chance to cast their ballots. And the American people know this. In a 2011 research poll, we learned that 2/3 of Americans believe that elections are usually for sale to the candidate who can raise the most money. And 86% thought that elected officials in the nation's capital are mostly influenced by the pressure they receive from campaign contributors. Such skepticism leads to less voter turnout. This is yet another serious consequence of the way we finance our elections. These are the things that are at the heart of our political finance problems in the US. But we aren't alone. The problem is global. Candidates everywhere in the world need resources to run for public office, and political parties need funding to support their activities in election and non-election years. And without fail, the financing of elections throughout the world is intrinsically linked to actual corruption or the appearance of corruption, especially where the funds come from private sources, from corporations and individuals. So what can we do about it? In the United States, there is ample and unbroken support for the constitutionality of transparency as a critical tool to address corruption and the appearance of corruption. We must build on that support in the US and worldwide to create a more accountable system and to provide the evidence base for future reforms. Transparency offers the best and most immediate prospect for change. Reformers in the US have tried and failed to enact spending limits for campaigns. Those have been stricken down by the Supreme Court. Reformers have tried and failed to date to institute a public financing system in the US. There was a brief period when we had such a system of partial public financing for presidential candidates, but that has disappeared in the last few years due to lack of voter support and politicians opting out of the system because they can raise more money if they are out of the system. Greater political finance transparency offers the promising route toward a more accountable government. Voters and watchdogs must know the source of these funds in order to gauge their corrupting influence on candidates or the policies they pursue, to prevent or curtail illegal fundraising, to uncover potential conflicts of interest, to ensure that funds are being spent properly, and to determine whether further changes to the country's system of political financing are required. Daniel Kaufman is correct. Disclosure is not the answer, but without it, we do not know what we do not know. Simply put, without political finance transparency, there can be little assurance of fairness in elections or accountability for the candidates for elected office. Another organization called Global Integrity in Washington, a nonprofit, tells us that in 120 countries, that weaknesses in the country's political financing systems are the #1 corruption risk globally across the entire public sector. Political finance transparency is the critical link to bringing accountability to all processes of government. The Sunlight Foundation and Global Integrity have looked very carefully at the state of transparency in political financing around the world. And we have found that it varies widely across the globe and in most countries falls woefully short of disclosure systems that limit corruption and foster accountability. For example, in a 2009 survey of 31 countries surveyed by Global Integrity, 29 countries scored less than 60 on a 100-point scale on questions assessing the effectiveness of laws regulating individual and corporate contributions, as well as on the auditing of those donations and campaign expenditures. Likewise, according to a recent IDEA database cataloging political finance laws, only 36 countries ban corporate contributions. And although 143 countries require some kind of financial reporting on the part of political parties or candidates, only about half of them require reporting from both parties and candidates, resulting in huge loopholes through which funds can be channeled. We, and many around the world, believe that now is the time to establish global political finance transparency reforms. And best practices, substantive explanations, and collaboration among the world's primary campaign finance stakeholders will create a global context for the often missing parochial political finance transparency efforts. Political finance transparency strengthens political finance regulation and has tremendously positive ripple effects across a range of other issues, helping to ensure that public policy is not skewed in favor of the largest donors and fostering trust in government from politically engaged citizens. To this end, I'm happy to announce here today for the first time that Global Integrity, the Electoral Integrity Project, and Sunlight will very soon launch a new project, now tentatively called the Political Finance Transparency Project, an ongoing effort to engage CSOs, government regulators, and political parties around the world in developing and promoting standards for how political finance transparency should work, ultimately providing policymakers with the arguments, background, and information they need to produce the strongest, most reliable political finance transparency policies possible. We hope to involve our colleagues from all around the world as we begin work on this project in the next month or so. There is one more issue I want to raise for our consideration today. Many countries are joining the Open Government Partnership with pledges to make their government's data and information more open and more inclusive. I know that India was part of the planning process of a voluntary multilateral effort, and that since your government has withdrawn support from it. Sunlight would agree with the Indian RTI activist skepticism about OGP as a paper tiger, particularly when it comes to political finance transparency. There is no reason to believe that countries without working freedom of information legislation or a strong culture of accountability would be eager to introduce radical transparency laws. After all, as I said earlier, information is power. We looked at the OGP commitments, and out of 48 countries with delivered commitments to the Open Government Partnership, only 6 of them had a hint at regulating the flow of money in politics. This is a big caveat that I'm about to talk about, but it is that the Sunlight Foundation has actually accepted OGP as an important new tool in the global fight for government transparency. Skeptical as we are about voluntary commitments, we know they make for weak reforms. But we will take every opportunity we can get to ask, demand, and fight for our government to take a larger, better, stronger stand using the Open Government Partnership as the opportunity. We believe there is reason to be hopeful that the new wave of interest in transparency generally and the Open Government Partnership specifically might produce some real results, especially for political finance transparency. Here are three quick reasons why. First, the global financial crisis has opened up significant political space in many countries to dig into political finance transparency norms. As citizens become more aware of scandals in which skewed public policy make the economic crises worse, they are demanding more transparency generally, and political finance transparency specifically. It is important to understand how the special interests distort public policy in all realms of our government operations. Second, recent progress on the Freedom of Information agenda has opened up, yes, right slide. The recent progress on the Freedom of Information agenda has opened up an opportunity to push on political finance transparency. As the world approaches close to 100 countries adopting FOIA laws and regulatory regimes, we now have more opportunity to open up political finance transparency than ever before. This is a markedly different situation from a decade or even 5 years ago. Third, with the rapid development and increased use of technology, there is being created a global momentum toward political finance reforms. The continued increase of technology suggests that now is the right time to make the push on political finance transparency. Initiatives like open contracting, we'll hear more about that later, the Global Initiative for Financial Transparency, the Opening Parliament Movement, IATI, and EITI, all demonstrate that not only are new global initiatives and international norms capable of creating change, but their growth is linked to technology on which they rely. Is that enough to find a way forward? Honestly, I don't know, but I think these are hopeful signs. It will definitely be a painfully slow process leading our politicians out of their habits of secrecy, which in many cases are essential for their survival. Yet the rising tide of government transparency creates an important opportunity to push for better disclosure norms and laws in political funding. In the upcoming months, We want to map the social and political and technological landscape of political finance transparency around the world, with special focus on disclosure trends. We want to work with you, our South Asian colleagues, and those from around the world in this important work, so expect to hear from us. In closing, I want to quote the philosopher Archimedes, whose sentiments I know you will agree with. He once said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." And together we will.